and go to other sessions and give contributions. So we have to be a little bit efficiently here to get our points done. So we planned for 3:45 and then build in a coffee break. I guess we would have half an hour time then and continue at 4:15. At the end of the day, maybe just to remind you, there's actually also a reporting back session. And I don't know, I've talked to a number of people, things might not have worked out as expected here. We have 4 people that should pick up on the points that they have heard today on either technology, governance, financing and economic instruments, capacity development. I am aware that Celeste has been a very good listener to the capacity side of things. Niels might have to catch up tomorrow because tomorrow these reporters are also going back. I'm saying a word to the stage under the different themes. On governance, I realized that we might have lost Dennis, who was wrapping up the session this morning, so there might be a gap here. But Roger is here now to potentially talk about the technology issues if he finds enough stuff that he can feed such kind of a report from. So, and then these reports are going into the thematic sessions tomorrow. You might be aware, we then have a session on technology where all reporters from all parallel sessions, from all different stakeholders come together just to talk about technology. Same thing for financing economic instruments, same thing for capacity building, and same thing for governance. Good, this is how it's supposed to work. I better hand over to Niels, who's just waiting for it.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. I'd like to welcome you to the session on risk. I will just explain a bit about our session this afternoon. In a minute I will start with a brief introduction on some messages which I think are useful for our discussion today, followed by some example how we deal with risk in the Netherlands, but also how this perspective can change. And then we turn to the most interesting part of our session, is a discussion moderated by John Matthews from Agua, which will start with our panel of a representative of different kind of government. It's Raymond Meyer from the International Commission for the Protection of the Danube. It's Pedro Domanitsky, if I pronounced it well, he's director of the Coordination de Itapu Binacional. My Spanish is not so fluent, as you notice. He's from Paraguay. We also have in our panel Mohamed Al-Rawadi from CEDAR, the Center for Environment and Development for the Arab region and Europe. And finally, Karen Lexon from the Stockholm International Water Institute. Maybe more familiar name is CBE. Okay, let's start. In our experience, and also in my experience, I think when we talk about risks, there's a role for government at different layers, and I think that governments should raise awareness among all stakeholders on the urgency and the importance of adaptation to the impact on water-related disasters caused by climate change and other global changes. I want to present to you some messages based on the paper we prepared for this conference and to discuss with you how we can promote this awareness. Yesterday we already heard about floods in Malawi and Mozambique, which killed at least 50 people, displaced many others, and is responsible for the failure of this year's crop already. And at the end of last year, in Brazil, Sao Paulo, a city of 20 million people suffered from the worst drought in years. Just 2 examples of a long and continuously renewing list of disasters. At the basis of these disasters, we find natural phenomena, but the occurrence of their impacts are heavily influenced by factors as climate change, population growth, urbanization, and inadequate land and water management. These disasters are not only impacting the life and well-being of hundreds of millions of citizens, but they are also more and more influencing socio-economic development of whole regions. It is of the greatest importance to learn from these disasters and to use what we have learned. People, investors, city planners, politicians have to be made aware of the risk they are exposed to. They need to get a better understanding of the underlying problems in order to be able to take adequate measures aimed at prevention. They have to be aware that zero risk does not exist. To help them getting this awareness, we have formulated 6 core messages, and let me briefly elaborate on them. So climate change is exacerbating the extremes in the hydrometeorological events, together with the other global drivers under change. But I mentioned already the population growth, urbanization, but also the increased assets. What you can see from the floods in Malawi and Mozambique, there is no doubt that climate change is already happening, and it is bringing us more extreme events. Even the most developed countries are vulnerable to water-related hazards. Who would have thought that New York and the New Jersey would be hit so heavily by Sandy? Climate change is one factor, but let's not forget some others. We are too much concentrating our capital in areas at risk. We are increasing our vulnerability by rapid urbanization, but also the lack of maintenance of critical infrastructure. Awareness is the first necessary step towards preparedness and the formulation of adaptive strategies. Disaster risk reduction, water resource management, and climate adaptation should not longer be treated as separate topics, not in the international discussion, but also we are focusing on relief action and not on repair, and not on preventive action. And water resource management often does not include disaster prevention and preparedness. Climate change is usually in one other department than the water department, and closer cooperation, or preferably integration of these policy themes, should be encouraged. And it might also be useful to make a closer link to spatial planning and development planning, including the finance part. More data and better tools for risk management are ready for use now and need to be more widely deployed to identify and prioritize actions. Better preparedness of citizens in terms of risk awareness and emergency planning are also essential. So new tools have been developed and are available to support preventive disaster management. And let me mention, for instance, the vulnerability assessment and resilience concept as 2 promising examples. Resilience concept need to be further developed for critical infrastructure, such as the supply of basic services like water, food, energy, transport, housing, finance and health. The combination of these concepts with risk assessment and mapping activities will prove to be very effective. And to do the 4th message, risk reduction, preparation and prevention are sensible investment that pay off in terms of reduced loss of life, avoided damage, and long-term economic growth and stability. So prevention pays, preparedness too. The continuous investment in the quality of our infrastructure has helped the Netherlands to keep the water away, and the preparedness of our Japanese colleagues has prevented enormously bigger damages last year when they were struck by 2 typhoons. More and more knowledge and tools are available to enable us to shift from reactive to preventive disaster management. We have sophisticated forecasting and early warning systems, not only for floods, but also for droughts. Risk prevention should be integrated with long-term planning. This allows communities and decision makers to identify and exploit opportunities for synergies with planned investments, including plans for adaptation to climate change. This is the base of our Dutch policies, but let me give you two other examples. Spatial planning should include considering restrictions for building in areas exposed to disaster impacts, thus reducing exposure to people and assets. The UNISDR currently facilitates the development of a new framework for disaster risk reduction, and this offers an excellent opportunity to include these latest experiences and insights in disaster risk reduction. The new Hyogo framework for action should therefore have a stronger foundation through a risk-based preventive approach. Such an approach should be accompanied by agreements on concrete actions as well as monitoring of these actions. Another example is from Vietnam. Floods play an important role in the life of the people in the Mekong Delta. Every year, floods inundate 2 million hectares and affect the lives of more than 2 million people. Normally, these floods are essential to food security and biodiversity, and people have a tradition in living with these floods. However, extreme flood events can be destructive and cause enormous damages. Vietnam is now merging traditional and innovative solutions by developing a so-called green infrastructure for disaster risk reduction, an update of the '94 Mekong Delta Master Plan, in which it includes also environmental and socio-economic development, as well as more recent innovation and modern approaches, such as green water defenses. This concept can be very useful in combination with the traditional measures for flood control. And in fact, several good practices of this concept can be found in the government decisions and design guidelines for infrastructure and land use. Now finally, the sixth message you can read. Uncertainties are no excuse for inaction. Uncertainties are inherent in long-term planning and should be accounted for in a comprehensive and flexible and adaptive approach. It must be clear that preventive action against disasters requires a long-term development perspective. It can therefore not be linked to disaster management alone. Preventive action needs to be embedded in an integrated process that incorporates water resource management and climate adaptation processes and be mainstreamed into national planning processes. Such an approach also enables optimization of resources, where, for instance, flood prevention infrastructure can also serve for purpose of drought prevention and at the same time hydropower or irrigation. There is a growing international recognition that water-related disaster risk management should be a programmed and flexible process of continuously improving management practices, in which short-term actions are linked to long-term goals. Flexibility is valued and incorporated, and multiple strategies are considered in a rational manner and different investment agendas that are interlinked. The development of the Hyogo Framework for Action 2 for disaster risk reduction and the post-2015 framework that includes disaster risk reduction offers an excellent opportunity to put this recognition into practice, developing a framework that builds on preventive action and that promotes flexible implementation of measures. Then I turn briefly to some illustration what we experience in the Netherlands. I skip this one. Maybe you know a bit about Netherlands, but for those of you who are not so aware, we have some history with water. We have a history of many centuries of defending our country against the sea and the rivers, and flood protection in the Netherlands used to be the basis on. Flood protection in the Netherlands used to be the basis of flood defense systems of dikes, dams, and storm surge barriers that are designed and maintained at high safety standards and is put down in law. The most recent real serious flood that hit the Netherlands was the flood of 1953, where almost 2,000 people drowned. And as a response, there was the first Delta Plan, consisting of several new dams and storm surge barriers and large-scale dike improvements, and which was finalized in 1997. The safety standards for this Delta Plan reflect the probability of occurrence of the highest water levels that need to be safely contained by our flood defenses. But during the finalization of our first Delta Plan, it became clear that these safety standards no longer reflect the value of the property and the number of people behind our dikes. It was also concluded that people living in flood-prone areas of the Netherlands are very vulnerable to flooding. Evacuating people out of the flood-prone areas in case a dike would breach is not an option for most of our areas, and the number of casualties during our one-off flood may be very high. From this understanding of current flood risk, and bearing in mind that ongoing growth of value to be protected and the projected impact of climate change, it was decided to change the Netherlands' perspective on flood risk management. We moved from a reactive towards a more proactive and flexible approach with a long time horizon. In our policies, we have to anticipate both sea level rise and higher and more irregular river discharges. So we made a second Delta Plan. The basic principles of this new Dutch flood risk policy are a minimum safety level with a probability of one every 100,000 years, the introduction of a set of safety standards for the flood defense based on a societal cost-benefit analysis, counteracting social disruption, and protect vital and vulnerable infrastructure. These principles have been anchored in the approach of the Delta program. And to briefly mention you the most important features of this program is that it knows an independent coordinator, our so-called Delta Commissioner, but also has a long-term financial commitment of 1 billion euros per year and a firm legal basis. In developing the program, many stakeholders were involved in joint decision-making to ensure that the decisions are socially broadly based. And of course, what I already mentioned, the risk-based approach was also central in this program, but also the flexibility. A flexible approach is adopted in the possible strategies by valuing flexibility with regard of timing of the implementation. And various investment agendas are linked and opportunities to mainstream actions with planned investment are used. Also, some new concepts were used, like building with nature. It's an example of green infrastructure. And this is also at the base of our program is that for our coastal flood defense protection, then soft measures are used where appropriate and hard infrastructure solutions where needed. But also we are aware that also nationally, but also in the international agenda, I think it's important to come from concept to action. And I think some of our concepts can also use also outside the Netherlands. The way we worked and where we treated disaster risk reduction, water resource management, and climate adaptation as a more integrated theme, I think it should be useful also in other areas, and also the incorporation of spatial planning. I think it's an important message there, which can be used also in other cases. I want to finalize with some 3 messages from this our experience over the last few years. That we think there is a sense of urgency to act now on these water-related disasters. We must invest in better understanding the problem and adopt a proactive but flexible approach. And we must take prevention measures before disaster strikes. Thank you. So, I hand over to John.
Okay. Thank you. My name is John Matthews. I am with an organization called the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA. AGWA is co-chaired by 2 organizations, the World Bank's Water Partnership Program and by SIWI, the Stockholm International Water Institute. I work with SIWI, which is the host of AGWA. And I'd like to invite right now all of my panelists to come to the front, please. We have the structure for the next segment is that we are going to have a series of cases. We've just had the overview by Niels, and we're going to, and he presented his case in particular. The rest of the talks are going to be, thank you, are going to be set up as, instead of PowerPoints, they're going to be overviews that are presented verbally. Hopefully they'll be short and succinct. We'll go through each person. They will talk about their individual experience and case in the context and terms in which Niels has already laid out. These cases are going to operate over a number of different levels. We're going to see things from a global governance perspective to a river basin level to the experiences at much smaller levels. So they're very, very different cases, but they're all going to be talking about what I think is an interesting tension that you see between how it is that we think about moments of crisis and how we engage in kind of day-to-day decision-making processes and the insights that come from new perspectives, such as climate adaptation, with older frameworks such as water resources management and DRR. So I'd like to begin by starting with Raimund. I would also ask each of my panelists to briefly introduce him or herself and briefly describe their position before going into their case. So Raimund is with the ICPDR, the International Commission for the Protection of the Danube River, and he focuses on climate adaptation issues.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, John, and good afternoon. As John introduced, my name is Raimund Meyer. I work for the International Commission for the Protection of the Danube River. This is the River Basin Commission facilitating the cooperation between the countries in the Danube Basin, which is the most international in the world. We've got 19 countries in the basin. 14 of them have a share of the basin, a major share of the basin, and are therefore cooperating in the frame of the Danube Commission. I'm working on climate change adaptation, but that's just one element. The main topic I'm personally working on is the implementation of the EU Water Framework Directive, but we're also working on the implementation of the EU Floods Directive in the basin. The topic of the conference is from vision to action, so we are facing the challenge of putting things into practice, and this on an international level with a large number of countries, so that's a major challenge. And recently we became active also in adaptation to climate change, what is necessary because it was recognized on the basin-wide level that it's becoming an increasingly significant threat. Risks are increasing, we have to do something. The first conference was organized in 2007, where the issue was first discussed, and we got then the tasks from the ministers of the Danube countries in 2010 to elaborate the first climate change adaptation strategy, which was elaborated and finalized in December 2012 and adopted by all countries, and currently we're in the process of putting it into practice, the strategy, implementing it. Addressing climate change in such a big basin like the Danube, in such a heterogenic basin, can be quite a complex issue, quite a challenge. And for us as a starting point, it was crucial. My phone is switched off. It was crucial to get first the science right, because all the discussions, it's very difficult to have the political discussions and the governance discussions without the common knowledge on the expected changes stemming from climate change. So a first starting point for us was that we launched a scientific study summarizing all studies which are in place already, so all scientific information, and critically assess this information. And this was very important towards looking at the topic through a same prism, through a common prism, so the countries have a joint understanding on the expected changes stemming from climate change. This was actually, the study was quite interesting for us because we see that with the downscaling, what is taking place, also the related uncertainties changing quite significantly, we have a common good picture on expected changes regarding temperature. So there's more security, let's say, on this topic. What we also see is that water scarcity and droughts is becoming more and more an issue. The Danube is somehow in a transition between expected increasing and decreasing precipitation between north and south. So on average, we expect the precipitation will be about the same, but this can look very different in different regions. So in the southeast, we see that on average, we expect around in the coming decades a decrease of precipitation between 20 and 30%. This is becoming even more serious when we look at the summer reduction, because we expect decreased precipitation in summer and increase in winter. So this can be quite a significant topic. What was also very interesting for us was that with regard to flood risk, there were some very contradictory messages. You always hear, well, flood risk, it's clear this will increase. The scientific information which is in place for our basin does not really confirm this always. So this is a little bit of an open issue, a lot of uncertainty connected with this. So what we in practice are facing is a challenge to deal with this existing uncertainty, but there are also approaches in place to deal with this existing uncertainty in the basin, and we are currently trying to implement this on a practical basis, because the main tools for taking adaptation measures are the river basin management plan according to the Water Framework Directive and the flood risk management plan according to the EU Floods Directive. Very briefly, just on floods, I'm not the expert on floods, but I'm most involved, of course, on flood risk management. And for us, it was important to get an agreement on the basic principles regarding flood risk management between the countries. And we elaborated the first draft flood risk management plan for the whole basin now, which is in public consultation and which will be finalized by December this year. So I think most of it was already mentioned by Niels, the basic principles and the strategies behind it, but it's very important. I just would like to raise this. The avoidance of new risk is one key element. This has very much to do with spatial planning, of course. Where do you put your new houses? Where do you put your new infrastructure? The reduction of existing risks, what has something to do with structural measures also, flood protection measures, but also the concept of providing more space for rivers, what is extremely important and what we try to promote a lot also. Strengthening of resilience, like the emergency response activities, early warning systems. Raising awareness, what has a major relevance for all kinds of activities. If people are not aware of the issue, they won't take action. And very important in the international context is for us the solidarity principle. And this I would like to really point out, because what one country is doing on flood risk management has a direct impact on other countries. if one country is building dams and channeling the river, it's transferring the problem further downstream. So really joint actions are needed, and this is one key principle for cooperation on flood risk management. And please excuse my ignorance, but I don't see a possibility to properly address flood risk management, for instance, or adaptation to climate change without cooperation on an international level. I think this is really a key message also I would like to provide from our side. So just maybe briefly to summarize, I think what we really achieved in the meantime was to gain a clearer picture on climate change and imposed risks also for the whole basin, so the countries have a joint picture. However, we also clearly see that these are just the first steps which we took, and further efforts are required towards the further reduction of the existing uncertainty in the future, and also the expected impacts on water-related sectors. This is very important for coming to better management decisions, because dealing with the uncertainty is a big issue. And we clearly see also that an adaptive approach is required. Niels, again, I would like to make reference to you. You mentioned this as well. Our approach is to use our management plans for the implementation of adaptation measures. We have an adaptive approach. We update our management plans every 6 years. And we also plan to update our adaptation strategy already in 2018, taking the newest scientific knowledge on board. And the approach is rather to put the fleet of integrated water resource management into the right direction. We cannot solve everything now, but we have to get the strategic approach right. And I think we are quite a good track on this, but a lot of questions still have to be solved. So I think the concepts to deal with risks are basically there, but the challenge we are facing is the practical application. And I think we are also exploring new grounds in this international context, while at the same time we're also trying to be really also service-oriented towards the countries, because everything what the International River Basin Commission is doing is only as good as the practical benefit is also for the countries which are actually forming this international commission.
Excellent, thank you. That was a very, very good overview. And I think part of what you hear too is one of the main themes that we're going to be tracing is this tension between how is it that we engage in learning and change through institutions, and the Danube is a powerful metaphor for that. It's 19 countries and many institutions within each of those countries, and moving from a region in which you have different kinds of disasters, floods in one end, droughts at another end, and potentially the decisions on one part of the basin having very significant impacts on other parts of the basin. So how do you go from a system in which you feel comfortable about it, you think that you know about it, to a new understanding, new ways of working together, potentially solving new kinds of problems? So that's hopefully a very, very good representation of where we're going with this. Then I'd like to have Mohammed go next. And Mohammed, if you could talk a little bit about your project and your institution too. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be here. My name is Mohammed Al-Rawadi, and I work as a Senior Water Resources Specialist at the Center for Environment and Development for the Arab Region in Europe, CEDARI, and I'm currently the Regional Monitoring and Evaluation Officer for the MUWINA project, which I'm about to talk about right now. The MUWINA project stands for Monitoring and Evaluation for the Arab Sector in North Africa. And it has been, monitoring and evaluation has been identified as one of the areas of weakness for enhancement of integrated water resources management in the Arab region in general and in North Africa in particular. So there has always been effort to report properly on the state of the water in different Arab countries and different Arab region and throughout the Arab region. But the main problem was that we always relied on the circulated data from other international organizations that we don't process ourselves, and we don't know where this data came from and how they were measured, and which governmental institution in each country has supplied. So this project was about taking monitoring and evaluation to the next level in North Africa and the Arab region. We basically wanted to make indicators that that we know how to calculate, we know how to assess, we know how to follow up, and we know how we can trace the changes in their values throughout in different years, so that we can come with historical trends to solve important problems such as climate-based risk and other things about water scarcity. So the way we started this project is that we had a phase called the rapid assessment phase. First of all, the 6 countries of North Africa were supposed to be part of this project, but for some reasons Morocco did not join in. So the 5 countries that are currently members of this project are Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Mauritania. So we started the rapid assessment process by visiting the 5 countries and building our connections there in different institutions that care about IWRM in all these countries. And we identified the current level of monitoring and evaluation in these countries, and we came out with rapid assessment reports that had lots of highlights on the current status of monitoring and evaluation, as well as available gaps and how the officials in these countries would like to address these gaps. And following on that stage, we went to the next stage, which is developing an enhanced monitoring and evaluation system for North Africa. And this was a very rigorous process. We first developed what we called a national task force in each member country of the project. And this national task force consisted of at least 10 members from different entities within the countries that deal with water resources and integrated water resources management. And we did lots of consultations, and we came up with the fact that we need indicators categorized in at least 15 categories, addressing 15 different issues that we need to strengthen the monitoring and evaluation for. These 15 categories were water and availability, water and uses, water and land use changes, water and services, water and health, water and quality, water and ecosystems, water and climate, water and governance, water and international relations, and water and energy. So for each category, we made sure that there is a national task force member in each country from the ministry or the institution or the entity that that is directly related to this category. And we started developing the indicators themselves. For each category, we had different indicators, and we had regional as well as national consultations to come out with the proper definition of this indicator, of each indicator under each category. And not also the definition, but the way to measure and assess this each and every indicator in each country, because the process may be different and the capabilities may be different in each one of the 5 countries. Then after a long period of time, we ended up with the first national baseline state of the water report for each of the 5 countries that are members to the project. These national baseline reports reported on indicator values under the 15 categories, but also identified areas where the indicators were not easily assessed, and therefore they identified what capacity they need to assess all the remaining indicators for. And each country made a national action plan for the second phase of that project, so that in the next state of the water reports we can assess all kinds of indicators, because some indicators will require extra capacity to be measured, but these indicators are very, very important. So we are now finalizing the first phase of this project, and what we have so far is 5 national state of the water reports for each country, as well as a regional state of the water report that talks about the state of the water in North Africa from a regional perspective. And we also have operational framework and guidelines report for the next 5 years. It shows how to assess the indicators under the 15 different categories for the next 5 years, because like, for example, it shows geographical locations that each country need to look at when they assess indicators about quality or climate vulnerability, for example. And now we are heading for the second phase. We are still fundraising for it, and we hope that we can have the state of the water reports every 2 years in each country of the 5 countries of MENA. That was a quick overview. Thank you so much.
That's great. And I'm just a couple of kind of focus questions. Say in contrast to the Danube, you're looking at really a set of countries that have common problems. They're not connected by a single basin, but presumably the major water source is groundwater. Is that right?
Well, actually, the state of the water reports, they not only deal about the national country level, but also on the transboundary level. There are 4 main transboundary basins that we address in these projects. The Nile River Basin, because Egypt is a riparian of, and also the Nubian sandstone aquifer system, which Egypt, because of Egypt and Libya, are a riparian of. Also, there is the northwestern Sahara aquifer. Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria are riparian of. And there is also the Senegal River, in which Mauritania is a riparian of. So yes, there is a transboundary level for the state of the water report in each country, and there are also separate state of the water reports for the basin as a whole. But still, the problem is that we will need lots of data from other countries that are not in the project. But we are trying to solve this issue now by contacting regional organizations that deals with river basins and aquifers.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we're going to turn to Pedro from Itapu, and I believe he's going to provide his case in Spanish. So.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias a la organización por la invitación. Y efectivamente,
in fact, when we are talking about this consideration of the irrigation systems, due to the effect not only of the flood but also of the floods, so extreme events linked to the climate change in a complete way, initially I would love to mention when we want to know what the Itapu is, I think this is really the core topic. Itapu is one of the most important renewable energy sources of the world, and recently in the year 2013 we have broken the generation record of the world. We have produced more than 98 millions of megawatts per year, and with a potency installed of 14,000 megas, equivalent more or less to 21 nuclear power stations of a medium size. Within this context, Itapu is really a section of control in the basin, a very important one. And when we are talking about the basin, we are talking about the basin of 920,000 square kilometers. This is a joint project between Brazil and Paraguay that was set up together, taking into account all the factors linked to this risk factor and extreme sceneries with recurring time of 10,000 years. Within this context, within this basic context, everything what is upstream the scenery was very well defined and analyzed, and in fact, we have got a strip of protection, a very important one, which has become one of the most important at the worldwide level, with an extension on the Paraguay side of 24,000 kilometers, and on the Brazilian side, on the left one, 1,000 kilometers, with an average width of 119 meters, with an operative strip of 5 meters in a direct level and 6 meters of width. This protection, very positive from the point of view of the constructive vision, was a very important element for the scenery of what it would be a biological corridor, where nowadays, within this context of upstream, we are constituting that element, which is articulating not only the protection of the basin itself and the reservoir too, but also an environmental element, which is very meaningful. The reservoir as such has got a length of 172 kilometers and a rate of renewal of water of 29 millions of cubic meters every 28, which is completely renewed, the whole volume of water. And there is also a central which is treating the water, but at certain moments we do that with regulation devices. The components linked to the basin with these risk factors are being worked on, as Mael has already mentioned, in a joint cooperation scenario together with... I just wanted to introduce just the photograph, the initial photograph, the first one. Because we have got another long presentation, but the idea really is just to show you the peak. I didn't want really to go into deep into the central plant. Within this context, as we've said, a cooperation environment and a cooperation direct environment together with Brazil, taking into account that this line of cooperation generates preventive actions regarding this upstream basin of these 920,000 square kilometers, and we are the second biggest basin in the south hemisphere, the third one in the whole planet, and there are 47 upstream central plants totally regulated from the point of view of the affluency. And we work in a cooperative way with the National Agency of Water of Brazil, with the CINEPAR of the Paraná state, and with the DINA of Paraguay state. We have got a monitoring process of variation of flows, totally in a satellite way with an STH system, hydrotelemetric, and we have got a set of models that has been applied in an international way, and we are adjusting it in order to mitigate or to supply these scenarios of growth of the river at an operative level. What it was very meaningful, and I also want to mention this case, was not what it has happened upstreams, but mainly the scenery given downstream. For instance, upstream, we are studying schemes of climate change and the growth of the design that is going to be bigger than the one we have foreseen, with one of the biggest physical models through a center which is the Computer International Center, and in the IPH, the Hydrologic Institute of the city of Porto Alegre, this PH in Porto Alegre. Downstream, we had the following situation. The Iguazu River, which goes downstream, and we have got there, we are there 11 kilometers away from the dam, had a very important affluency. We started with 30,000, and within this context, this river is perpendicular to the flow of the Paraná and generated a very important reservoir effect. So when one could think that all the adverse effects are upstreams, we had it downstream with a scenario of articulation, not only upstreams and with the 47 plants, but also downstreams, especially in the Iguazu, in a coordinating action in order to minimize the line of flooding in the area where usually we have never had floods because the river was totally regulated. This situation of sceneries that have been conditioned by the climate change. We have been working on with the system in an early stage, applying technological tools in the basis of the free software, and also a group of tools designed and prepared for a construction of capacity within the very same central. And now we have got a scenario with an experimental basin where we had to articulate with the local authorities, and we had to analyze situations that they had not been foreseen previously, not only for the operation line, but also for the freezing and ventilation systems of the generators. So we had to adapt, and this also involves that the basin of flow downstreams in the dam with a joint and coordinated work together not only with the local authorities but also the social stakeholders. And this also involves the application of models, of tools, and principally actions to get adapted to this climate change. This is something that we are designing nowadays, and we want really to replicate it in everything done downstreams. The whole of the actions and the work of upstreams is totally regulated thanks to this STH system, and the environmental and social part is being worked on with the procedure of Dr. Nelton, the director of the Brazilian agency, regarding the program Agua Boa, where we are mitigating the actions, the environmental actions that are inciding in the basin with an integral system of this prevention of risk, not only this affluental component, but also the environmental one and the social one, taking into account this food safety. That's it.
Well, spanning ultimately several basins that is having a significant set of, in some ways, unintended consequences. And how can we reconceive, adapt, I think, in its largest sense, not just in a climate adaptation sense, the operation of that infrastructure with new systems in order to really sustain development in that basin. So a very interesting kind of case. Thank you very much. Now we'll go from looking at a single dam and its environs to looking at a global scale of governance with Karin Lexian. And we saw, I believe, some of the concepts that you'll be addressing in your talk yesterday. But I'm assuming that in this case you'll probably explore some more of the connections between DRR and adaptation from a global governance perspective.
That's a very open question, so let's see how I can respond to that one. Yes, and I shouldn't presume that everyone heard what I said yesterday, so I think maybe to mention a few things. I think to start with, looking at risks, and also being a little bit disappointed sometimes with the low profile that water plays in the climate change negotiations that I've been followed. Well, in this capacity as working with CIVI for 6 years, but I actually took part in the Kyoto conference a long time ago, so I'm one of the climate fossils, but I had another hat at that time. But it's interesting to see that in Davos, where the World Economic Forum met, just some days ago. There, every year they launch what they called a global risk perception survey, and water has stepped up to the #1 largest risk in that report, and that is quite interesting. And I hope that message is being sent to both Geneva, where the disaster risk reduction framework is being negotiated, and also Geneva again when the climate negotiations are going to take place to prepare for COP21 in a few weeks. So 900 experts from this survey have said that a future water crisis would have the most dangerous consequences. And they are pointing at water crisis would be closely linked to food production, extreme water events, and as we know, 90% of the 1,000 most dangerous disasters since 1990 have been water-related. So that's very true. They also say that this water crisis is linked to the failure of climate change adaptation, to interstate conflicts, social instability, and failure of urban planning. So this is a strong message, and if you'd like to read more, I can refer you both, of course, to the World Economic Forum websites, but also to the CV website where we have some news about this, and also link to the report. So where does this lead me? I talked yesterday about the necessity to try to emphasize and address water in the intergovernmental processes that we have at stake this year. And I was talking about 4 processes that are interlinked. The one on the disaster risk reduction, linking up with the hope to have a new framework, a post-2015 framework. The negotiations towards Paris, towards the end of this year for COP21. Of course, the negotiation on the Sustainable Development Goals, and also the negotiations and discussions on financing for development. And I think it's very important to say that we don't want water for the sake of itself. Water is not, to have water in the text of all those conferences is not a mean in itself. But it is important since water is a connector. It is important because to the end of the day, all these global agreements are meant to be landed and implemented on the ground. And if we would have a silo approach that we would discuss climate adaptation in one avenue, disaster risk reduction in another one, SDGs in a third one, we might end up with a very ineffective way of dealing with those crises on the ground. And so I think here that's what we've been trying to say when we have been talking to governments over quite some years. And I think what we've seen is an increasing recognition of the importance of water. We've seen that, for instance, in the UNFCCC, both AGWA, CV, Global Water Partnership, and other water communities have been asked more and more frequently to submit information and knowledge, and that is good. But of course, we'd like to see water more prominently also in the discussions and the official documents than what we see right now. And there I also want to say, since water is a connector, I think this is also a challenge to water people amongst governments, amongst academia, business and NGOs, to also reach out to other sectors. So we can't sit in our own box and talk about the importance of water being a connector. We have to be with the energy people, with the food people, with the climate people. So this is still a challenge to ourselves, I think, and also within the governments to connect between the different departments. So that is an important challenge, I think. Secondly, what we have been trying to do as CIWI, AGWA, and other people is to talk about the necessity to translate experiences and knowledges on the ground. And I think the examples that have been set out here are excellent examples on knowledge and experiences that needs to be fed into the global discussions. I often feel that there's like 2 so completely different environments when you would be sort of working on practice on the ground, and when you are in those UN corridors to try to talk about the policies. And here I think it's still a big challenge to the different parties. No, I'm not a government. It was said I was Sweden. I'm not Sweden. I'm Stockholm International Water Institute. So thank you, Niels, to give me. In the program, it's actually stated Sweden. CV works closely with the government of Sweden. I've been on many of the delegations as an advisor, but that is in personal capacity. So just to be clear on that difference between CV and Sweden. But if I wanted to challenge then governments and parties, I think that a more interactive way of both negotiating and listening to the knowledge and to try to take in the knowledge from the ground is very important. And that can also help breaking some of the deadlocks that governments face in their negotiations. And I actually think that the process towards the Sustainable Development Goals has been an important case where at least both the UN system and governments have tried to listen to voices from civil society, from NGO science, etc. And I think this is going to be really important in future to try to connect between those examples that we see also being presented here, also being discussed in this conference, and try to find way to feed it into the negotiations. You said I perhaps wanted to talk about adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And I think I said a few words about this yesterday. I was saying that I can see that in the texts, I know I have some people here in the audience that have more recent texts than what I've seen, but I've understood that there are references to the importance of linking between the different processes in the text that is on the table for negotiations for the post-2015 disaster risk reduction framework. Then the question is, how do we take these words into real action? I think this is a question that we could discuss, perhaps. In the UNFCCC negotiations, there's a program called the International Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage, with the idea that there are circumstances where adaptation isn't enough to cover up for what is happening. And that is, of course, the same as dealing with disasters. So I think here's a concrete challenge, and that is how to bridge between what is being built up under the UNFCCC on disaster, on loss and damage, and what is being decided on disaster risk reduction in the other negotiation. And I think that here water could play a much greater role as an example, and water resources management. You had it in your key messages too, Niels, and I thought that was really good. So I think one question is, how can we help providing water as a very good example on the necessity to link on the ground in the implementation of these agreements coming out of the negotiations? Maybe I can stop there for now.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. And I'd just like to ask Niels perhaps to give like a 2 or 3 minute response. And I'd like to sort of start that. He obviously gave an excellent case from the Netherlands, but there's a great quote, one of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill: "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And I'm struck by what I know about Dutch history, that the event that Niels referred to in 1953, this massive breach with the ocean that resulted in so many people dying, was a crisis that really led to a rethinking at a strategic level that has been perpetuated, a lesson that was fully learned and developed and evolved over some time, and I think it represents probably the start, at least in Dutch history, of the kind of merger of these approaches. Has become very central even to your current foreign policy. So I wondered if you could perhaps reflect on that for a moment.
Yes, just a few words on this. 93 disaster was a change, was a changer, but also the basis of this new rethinking of our flood risk policies. The basis for that was also an almost disaster, where we realized how vulnerable we are. And that started the whole process in which we first built our knowledge gap, so to say, but also we're thinking the present strategy, building hard infrastructures only, isn't sustainable. So for that, some rethinking was needed. On the other side, the times were changing. We had the society has changed. So to involve the citizens and stakeholders, there was much more room for them to say what they thought were important. So for instance, when we started with the Room for the Rivers, it was not only about safety, but also what we called spatial quality. So there were two dimensions in one more or less traditional safety project. So yes, never waste a good crisis. Also, that's to say from a political perspective, it makes things possible. When the national security, like for instance in the States, but even in a different way in the Netherlands, when there is some safety at stake, then the political differences are much, they diminish in a way, and it's possible to reach some agreement, which is in other cases not possible.
Excellent, thank you. Now I'd like to really open the floor up to questions, for additional comments. We have a microphone, and if you could please say your name and your organization that you're affiliated with.
Actually, I have a question to Pedro, so I will address it in Spanish. My name is Natalia Nikiforova. I'm working for the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Pedro, muy interesante tu presentación sobre la presa. Lo único es
your presentation on the press, but the only thing when you were mentioning the names of the rivers and you were looking at the map, I missed the perspective of Argentina. What is the role of Argentina in this cooperation? Are you consulting with Argentina on this project? Is there any cooperation in general? Yes, precisely as Mael mentioned. The secret is that here, the secret here is integration. One of the first institutions is the Intergovernmental Coordinating Committee, coordinating the different countries of the La Plata River Basin. Although it is one of the most, the safest tectonic plates in the Earth, the dam is built and the whole regulation system are built on land which could present some dangers. We have a line of interaction not only with Argentina in itself, but with the whole La Plata River Basin, and we interact with them. And we are working on an early warning system, not because of the dam river scenario, but because of the climate change scenarios that produce extreme events, like in 2013, where we saw that there was a river generating 30,000 cubic meters, which are situations that are not considered normally. And however, downstream in the Argentinian area, there is another dam.
I'm here wearing two hats. One is the WWF, and the other one is Butterflies. About the Danube, about the Netherlands, about your system in Paraguay. You would think that what happened in Sri Lanka could not have happened because there was a warning system. They had broadcasts. They had looked at the risk of what happened on the slopes. So the analysis we made later, because it was a disaster, is that because the people were warned, but were not offered any alternatives. If evacuation is not the one, then how can we build resilience in those groups that they start thinking about alternatives if all the measures we've taken do not work?
So first Niels, and then if there's another that would like to also respond.
Okay, thank you, Lesja. We became aware of after some events in the United States, the Katrina disaster, that there also for the Netherlands there is no zero risk. And that's made us think of what to do if such a disaster strikes. And that is also a way in which, in the policy circle, start some thinking about shouldn't we offer an alternative just in case, and that made that we have some national coordination which exercise is what would happen if such a disaster strikes, and does everything works? Does the protocol work? What if? But still, then we know there can be something can go wrong, and that's why we also recently started a campaign that people are aware there is no zero risk, and that in some cases evacuation is not an option, and they should be prepared, if possible, in their situation, that they move up instead of going away. So that campaign of awareness, well, it started last year, because we know that you have to offer an alternative to people when suddenly something appears and they don't have the time to go to another place. So
really sort of trying to find alternatives is the key thing. And I think this goes back also to the discussions in the negotiations sometimes, because sometimes we tend to think that adaptation is these technical systems or building high walls and barriers, instead of really thinking of the full spectrum of social and environmental and economic resilience building, that I think in the long term is maybe not more important than an early warning system, but it needs to be combined. So this is also an example on the risk for being too single-sided when we are discussing things.
Thank you for 5 excellent presentations. I have 2 questions. One relates to the science, the information that we use to make decisions. And I think it goes to the point that you made, Raymond, about the climate change projections. That, in your case, if I understood correctly, and I think this is my question, did those projections actually indicate that that there wouldn't be an increase in the flood intensity in the future, or did they say we don't know if there will be an increase in the intensity of floods in the future? And I think it goes to a bit also to some of to the points from the colleague from the Arab states and also Karen's point of linkage between DRR and climate change. I think this is what information do we use for decision making between climate change projection and the more empirical evidence of past losses for disasters. And my second question is for Neil. So there was a lot of discussions this morning in some of the other stakeholder groups around accountability of governments, what are the types of legislative frameworks that work, and you mentioned that in the Netherlands you put a new set of legal frameworks in place in your Delta Plan, or the revised Delta Plan. Could you provide maybe some examples of some of these legislations and how effective they may have been?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Maybe I try to answer to address the first question. As I mentioned, the study which was done for the Danube Basin was not like a new model, because we said if we have a new study, it's just a new study next to other studies which are already existing. So we said, let's collect all the information of already existing studies which are in place. We have got sometimes areas in the basin better coverage by more scientific information compared to other ones. But what was also done was to make a comparison of the results of these different research studies. And with regard to floods, it turned out that some studies said, yes, the risk or that the flood risk will increase in the future. Others said there will not be a change. So it's a little bit difficult to handle then such like different results, because you cannot, based on this result, say, well, there's most probably an increase of flood risk. However, we don't say there will not be an increase of flood risk. We're just aware that there's quite some uncertainty still in there. What is not so much the case, for instance, for temperature, for drought situations. In general, my impression is, without being an expert on climate modeling, that the models are better with regard to addressing averages, but not like the shorter the hydrological events are getting or precipitation events are getting, the more insecurities in the statements in. So what we try to do is to deal with this uncertainty. What we have currently in place is information on expected changes in temperature and precipitation. What is a little bit lacking still is expected impacts on hydrology. for the whole basin, let's say. For some parts of the basin, we have this information, for other parts not. It's maybe interesting to mention also, we had a look also at other basins in Europe, what they are doing. And basically, they have also quite similar challenges. Another neighboring basin, for instance, they have information on impacts on hydrology, but the results there are also, well, the average runoff will change from -10 to +15%. I mean, based on this, when you use this information for decision makers, for the discussions, for the political discussion on management plans, it's very difficult to deal with this. What we are trying to do is to apply really the no-regret measures and win-win situations also. And we had discussions in our expert groups with our experts on the draft joint program of measures for flood risk management and for the river basin management plan for the Water Framework Directive. We discussed all the measures and we thought, what does it mean also on the climate change? And I think if I want to put it into one sentence, what turned out was, well, most of the measures, or basically all of them, are also good under climate change. When you do proper river basin management planning, it's good also under climate change. When you get your flood risk management right, it's also good under climate change. So when you really drop it down, you can say the best adaptation measure is to get your river basin management right. And I think this is for us an additional push and additional confirmation that we're on the right track. And it's an additional argument to really strengthen the cooperation also in the basin. This is just maybe one example of like an approach how we try to deal with the whole topic.
All right, and then there's a question for Niels, I think.
Yes, thank you. But on this first question also, I think when you take a long-term perspective also in disaster risk management, and then you look at adaptation, in a lot of cases you are talking about the same problems and the same measures you can take, because a lot of these measures are also water related. But then to your question about the Delta program, the main objective of the program is to have this to provide an adequate flood risk management strategy, but also to ensure a fresh water supply. And we used a scientific basis to be aware of what we can expect, what are the uncertainties, and we used the legal part to make clear what are the responsibilities, and also lay down who should act in what case. And what was I think special about it is that we incorporated the value of flexibility, because when you see a problem in the future, you don't always have to act now. Also, you can take time to get more knowledge and look for optimal solutions. So now it is approached that some of the measures will be taken in 10 or 20 years, also depending on how climate will evolve over the coming decades. And also to look for possibilities to combine with revitalization of existing infrastructure. So then also from a more economic perspective, you can optimize.
Great. Alex.
Thank you, and thank you all for string of very good presentations. Further to what Karen said, or very much in support of Karen, I really believe that the kind of debates that we have in this water community should be fed back into all kinds of other debates where we talk about these, let's say, planetary threats that are threatening us, and climate change and all the other, that's ecological anthropocenic disasters that we are facing. Certainly, if you look a bit further in the second half of this century, talking about risk, it is interesting to look at the outcome of the 9/11 Commission. After 9/11, of course, there came this commission that looked at what really went wrong on 9/11. Could we have prevented it? And their conclusions are basically 2 points. One is that there was stovepipe thinking, and that refers to what Karen was saying. That okay, we all talk about water, and somebody else all talk about climate and food, and in the water energy food nexus we try to combine it, but in that case you miss, let's say, the political, the risk angle is often not mentioned when you are at these water energy food nexus meetings. So the one was the stovepipe thinking. It's really important to try to look across those issues. The second one was described as a failure to imagine. Basically, it was 9/11. We knew everything. We knew there were people that could hijack planes. We knew that there were 2 big towers there. We knew that you could fly into them. We knew that there were people willing to kill themselves and kill many people. You just had to add them up. They did it, but the people that had to prevent it, they didn't. That's very much the same here as well. When you talk about, what the risks, see it in a broad context of everything that is happening in this planet. So that is including the climate, it's the economy, it is the international political situation, it is the defense as well. So if you look at it from a security point of view, a real kind of butterfly effect, if I can steal that word from the chaos theory and from Lesha, who's raising her hand right now. Take the Middle East, the area that is now controlled by ISIS or ISIL or IS or whatever the nom de guerre they use nowadays. That is drought, both in that area as well as other regions like Russia, was a factor that influenced that you got the revolutions, the Arab Spring, and finally the war in Syria. But now it ends up that water is now actually used as a weapon by ISIS, by having the Al-Taqba dam is now full of dynamite. They can blow it up whenever they want. The Fallujah dam is just closed. One side is dry, the other side villages are drowning. And we saw the intervention that was needed in the Mosul dam. So not very much a question, more a comment in very much in support in try to take this holistic view. Perhaps there are comments on the security aspect, and I leave it there. Thank you.
Right. Did we have one other person? Okay, here, and this will be the last question, and then we'll have a quick sum up from each person.
My question is just to extract, or hear your views. Is when we discuss, climate change issues, risk issues, and so on, river basin management and associated risks in developing countries quite immense. Developed countries have got means of actually creating that resilience, overcoming vulnerabilities. What kind of capacity development and skill transfer approach you may be already experiencing or undertaking in the various river basins, whether it is in Danube or Itaipu, or from the experience of Netherlands to transport it to developing countries where, the disaster risk which results into immediate days of poor people in developing countries imminent, mostly due to extreme events. So could you say a few things how, capacity development and the skill could be transferred to other less developed situations?
So maybe one person could respond on how we take lessons that have been learned, often hard learned in one place, and exchange them, transfer them, help build capacity in other places.
Sí. Bueno.
First, the first component would be it would be very interesting to take into account the cooperation element and the capacity development of the dams with more experience. In the case of dams, for example, Itaipu, 30 years operating, 40 years implemented, and we put this knowledge at the availability of Africa or any other sector or country or region of the world for capacity building transfer, as well as the fundamental or structuring factor is main one. That's why this type of fora is very interesting, because it enables us to exchange experiences. In the case of systems, not only does it give us an opportunity to speak about tools, but also adaptation measures that we had to carry out in developing countries also with resources. Because when we are using creativity, we minimize the expenses and the conditions more favorable are implemented so that these processes become a reality a long time.
That was a very good response. I'd like to ask, in conclusion, if we start at Karen's end, moving towards me, if each person could just name one or two kind of major points from your institutional and personal perspective about the concept of risk from a government perspective, particularly how risk may reflect new challenges, but may also reflect new opportunities to bridge old divides.
You wanted me to start?
Yes, please.
That I was have more time to think, so I try to talk from the top of my head. Well, referring to risks and referring back to my institute, of course, a reflection would be, I've been working with CV for 7 or 8 years, and I've seen a tremendous increase in the interest for water in the business sector over this time. And this is because they really address water scarcity as a risk. And in this, I think there's also an opportunity that we see that things are moving and something that also needs to be addressed, because the other side of that coin is that we could see sort of private sector as the solution, or hope that all of a sudden this will solve the issue. It's not going to solve the issue. After all, the private sector are there to make business. So we shouldn't be too but I think it's interesting to see that risk has, and also what we are trying to advocate for is really seeing water efficiency and water sustainability as a risk reducer. Secondly, on my second point would be risk related to security issues, water, and so forth. And we are, not me myself, but many of my colleagues are very much involved in peace, water diplomacy, transboundary issues. And we like to say that, yes, water poses a risk, big risk for conflicts, but it's also a tool for collaboration and cooperation. And we can see that, for instance, in the Jordan River, where we are active, that the discussion over how to sort of use the Jordan River actually helps dialogue between, for instance, Palestinians and Israelis. So the challenge is also an opportunity when it comes to water as a risk for conflicts.
Excellent, thank you. Mohammed.
Well, I would like to focus on three main risks that we fear a lot in North Africa. The first one is water scarcity as a standalone issue, regardless of climate change. I'm talking about water scarcity as a result of population increase. Then again, there is climate change, and it's very well connected with water scarcity as well. And the third risk is climate-based disasters, floods and droughts. From the perspective of the project that I'm currently working on, the Mwina project, I would like to say that the motto of this project was you cannot assess what you cannot measure, or you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So we have been trying hard to come up with a better assessment, with a good assessment that can enhance decision makers and that can come out with the alternatives that the colleague here was talking about. For example, if we're talking about floods, for example, in North Africa, we have a very big problem in defining floods. Because usually floods in different parts of the world, floods are directly connected to their impact Like, for example, we know there is a flood somewhere when we know that there were this number of people displaced, this number of people suffering. But in North Africa, we have vast areas that are not populated. So many flash floods may just go unnoticed because of that fact. So if we are if we're talking about monitoring and evaluation here, we cannot only focus on floods or droughts from the point of view of the impact that they caused. We're looking for historical trends that should tell us about the future. So we should relate the floods not to their impact on humans only, although that's the most important thing, but we have to trace them in relation to climate, in relation to precipitation model that Raymond was talking about. This was just one of the examples of how we trace these risk measures. But again, you cannot manage what you cannot measure.
Great, thank you.
Two points from my side. I still have this dream that at the end of this year, we have the same disaster risk reduction indicators in our major processes, the Hyogo Framework for Action, the SDGs, and the COP21. So I think when we are able to get in close connection with the people who are negotiating these processes, I think it's still something we should strive for. Because I think this is an opportunity once in a lifetime. The second point is, I think that also from this session, it's important that water-related risks are not only framed within this cycle, but we should make the more clear connection to the social, economic, and environmental dimension, and also bring the message that investment in risk prevention pays off.
Good. Raymond.
Yes, thank you. Maybe just briefly touch on this intersectoral aspect again, because this was also raised from the audience. What came out in our discussions was, or what is my personal impression is also, there's no single climate change expert there. Maybe, John, you are the one which comes most closest to a climate change adaptation expert, but we had the discussion, should we have now one group specifically dealing with it? Our decision was, no, it's an intersectoral issue. It's a cross-cutting issue. It requires for all our experts to take it on board. So we all have to become climate change adaptation experts, let's put it that way. And the IWRM approach and the river basin management approach is extremely useful for taking on board climate change adaptation. We're also involved in the UNECE working group on climate change adaptation. The other basins where also climate change adaptation strategies are developed. What I see from my perspective is also quite often it's a little bit difficult when you don't have this framework in place to put the adaptation measures in place. So get the cooperation mechanisms in place is one very important starting point. And then mainstreaming and capacity building is required. So we are currently trying to do this. Everybody's talking now, or we are discussing it with our expert groups, climate change, and for some people it's quite a new topic, but still we're forcing them to deal with it because it's such a broad issue. And basically, maybe a final statement, basically adaptation to climate change is long-term risk management.
Super. Pedro.
Sí.
I would like to take into account the topic of these transboundary basins, river basins, not only to talk about the risk model as a function, as a threat, as a kind of threat or vulnerability, but also to interpret within the field of these transboundary river basins a management of the risk as the first element for this cooperation management, cooperation among countries, among institutions, among resources from the same basin as an operative element. And Niels has already made a very good observation about that, with that view of conceptualization of an integrated management that really can take into account the socio-environmental components and the elements linked to everything which is technology in order to minimize the impact line and really to solve quickly these components of mitigation and adaptation, mainly taking into account the scenarios of climate change, that because there's so much technology available and with which so many actions can be prevented or foreseen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. A good final intervention on the topic of transboundary management, and I think a very rich, full definition of what sustainability should be. Karin Lexian asked me to apologize for her. She had to rush. She's about to speak in another event. But I'd like to have a round of applause for our panelists, for our translator, and to you, the audience. Thank you.
And thank you, John, for moderating this. So also for you, a small applause.
All right.
Session and interesting inputs. I think we have looked at risks, risk management, risk assessment from very different angles. We have one more session ahead of us now for this afternoon, which is looking into water quality issues.